Hello. In this lecture, we're going to start off talking about pre-modern East Asia. We'll begin with some background about China. But first, we need to think about some of the questions we're going to be asking about in general regarding East Asia. If East Asia, that is China, Japan, and Korea, was wealthier and more powerful than the West, why did the West eventually overtake these three countries? Second, why, considering the wealth and power of the East Asian countries, did they not turn outwards and expand or develop a scientific revolution? Right. So we have this kind of question that goes to the center of our course. Why is it the West, even though it's behind other civilizations in the year 1500 or so, why does it eventually become so wealthy and powerful when those other civilizations have a head start? Right. That's kind of the basic background to the class. And so then part of the answer for that is the fact that China, Japan, and Korea focused on stability over development. That's one reason why they're, in a sense, the West will overtake them. So we have to ask, why did they do that? And they had good reasons for doing so. Right? Sometimes there's just a temptation when looking back at history to say, well, why did people do that? Were they kind of dumb? What were they thinking? And the answer is usually that they made decisions that made sense at the time, and of course they didn't know what the future would hold. So what we're going to try and understand is these countries, they were so wealthy, they were so advanced, so they could have developed further, but they chose stability instead. Why did they do that? And we also need to try and understand how East Asian countries were different and are different. Sometimes people lump China, Japan, and Korea together, and it makes sense because they had a lot of interaction, but they are in fact different countries. And I want to tell you a story that I think illustrates how that's also very important to people living in those countries. I know a couple Koreans who came to the United States and they visited New York City. And they were walking down the street, and a homeless man approached them and asked them for some money. And they refused to give him any money. And as they left, the homeless man said, "You Chinese jerks." He actually swore at them. He didn't say jerks, but I try and keep my lectures G-rated. And one of the Koreans shouted back, "We're not Chinese." And they walked a little bit, and the other Korean said, "You should have said we're not jerks." Right? In a sense, these two Koreans were more offended that they were being called Chinese than that they were being called jerks. Right? It was like, I might be a jerk, but darn it, I'm a Korean jerk. So you can see that kind of pride in identity, right? We're Chinese, we're Japanese, we're Koreans. And it's good for us then to know what makes those three countries different, because it's important to the people who live in those countries. So, like I said, we're starting with China and the background of China. And central to understanding China is what's called the Chinese Imperial system. Now, in China, they have had something called an emperor. And from the Chinese perspective, there was only one emperor. Right? So no one else was emperor. There was no equal to the Chinese emperor. There's just that one emperor in the whole world. He's in China. And in fact, the word China in Chinese, I can't pronounce it very well in Chinese, but Zhongguo means middle country or middle kingdom. I want to stress, when they say middle, they don't mean medium, they mean central. Right? We're kind of the center, not only of the world, we're the center of the universe. That's why we have an emperor. What makes the emperor so special from the Chinese perspective is that the emperor has the mandate of heaven. Right? You can kind of think of heaven as like God. It's not a perfect kind of way of lining up things, but it's helpful. But the idea is that heaven, that is God, chooses the most moral family or dynasty to rule China. Right? That's called the mandate, the rule of. So heaven looks down and says, aha, that is the most moral family. They should be in charge. And then heaven makes sure that they become in charge of China. And then they rule. And just so you know, dynasty just means ruling family. Right? So the idea of the mandate of heaven is that heaven, that is in a sense God, chooses the most moral family to rule China. The emperor then doesn't just have political functions, the emperor also has religious functions. Right? So the Chinese emperor is not simply a secular ruler, a political ruler only. The Chinese emperor also had religious duties. So the Chinese emperor, it was believed, if he performed his moral and ritual duty correctly, the people would prosper. So if you look at that image there, That is the altar of heaven. Now, usually when you think of an altar, a place where sacrifice occurs, you usually think of it being inside a building. But because this altar is dedicated to heaven, there's no ceiling, right? Because when you make the sacrifice, usually this is burning some meat and some wheat, some grains. You want the smoke to float up to heaven so heaven could receive the sacrifice. And it was the job of the emperor to perform such rituals, or to have a deputy perform them. The emperor didn't always actually do this ritual itself. But the idea is that the Chinese emperor is not just a political figure. The Chinese emperor, by performing correct rituals and having correct morality, helps keep harmony between heaven and earth. So the emperor is a mediator, someone who connects heaven and earth, and through their ritual performance, through their religious rituals they perform, and by being a moral person, they keep heaven and earth in harmony, and then everything goes well, and the people will prosper, right? People will prosper, right? Because if the heaven and earth are in harmony, thanks to the emperor, then rain will fall when it's supposed to, will be in the right amount, we'll have good crops, we won't have famines, we won't have droughts, and so forth. Now, fortunately, if you're an emperor and you're not doing a good job, if you oversleep and miss the rituals, or if you're kind of a bad person, heaven will not immediately kick you out of your job. Heaven will warn you if you're doing a bad job, right? Heaven will give you warnings. What sort of warnings? Well, things like comets and eclipses, right? So, think about an eclipse. An eclipse is kind of freaky, especially when it's like the sun being blotted out in the middle of the day, right? I remember I've experienced eclipses before, you probably have too, and it's kind of odd to be out at like 2 p.m. and it's dark, like it's night. That, to people who don't know the science behind it, right? They would have known that what causes an eclipse in this time period. That's kind of a freaky event. So, and comets, especially, these bright stars flying across the sky, we have a lot of light pollution, so it's hard to see the stars. But if you've ever been out in the wilderness, out in the where there's not a lot of light, it's amazing how bright the sky is at night. And you would see things like eclipses. So if an emperor fails to predict these things, these are seen as signs that the emperor is doing a bad job, right? Because it shouldn't go dark in the middle of the day. That's a sign that the universe and humanity are out of sync. We have disharmony. Similar with a comet. Here's the thing, though. If an emperor can predict those things, the emperor says, next week there's going to be an eclipse at 12:03 p.m., going to happen totally. And then it happens, people are like, the emperor really does is in harmony with the universe. The emperor does know what he's doing. So it was incumbent on emperors to be good at astronomy, or to have officials who were good at astronomy. Because a comet or an eclipse, if they appeared without being predicted, people would say, that's a sign the emperor's doing a bad job. In contrast, if he predicts those things, it shows that he has a deep knowledge of the cosmos, and therefore is clearly the person who should be ruling heaven. Now, that might seem kind of an odd way to us today, since we understand the science behind these things, but I would just point out that a ruler who has a government that's working properly should be able to be efficient enough to do these things. And an inefficient, lazy, bad emperor would probably fail to predict these things. So it does give you an indication of overall government efficiency. Now, here's the thing. Bad dynasties can lose the mandate and be overthrown. The mandate of heaven is not permanent. You can lose the mandate of heaven, right? You could lose the mandate of heaven if you consistently do a bad job. If you have all these eclipses and comets that you don't predict, you can be overthrown. And one thing I want to stress, the Chinese were very practical. Like I said, when the emperor's doing a good job, the people should prosper. What do the Chinese mean by prospering? Do you have food to eat? Do you have clothes to wear? Do you have a safe and comfortable place to live? If the answer to all of those questions, food, clothing, shelter, is a yes, I've got those things, the emperor's doing a good job. But as more and more people say, no, we don't have those things, that means the emperor's not doing a good job. Heaven may change and choose a new family or dynasty, and they will receive the mandate of heaven. And so when things get really bad, when people start saying, no, we don't have those things, we don't have enough food, we don't have enough clothing, we don't have shelter, they start rebelling. And if the leader of that rebellion is successful, then the Chinese would say, well, they could only have been successful because heaven transferred the mandate. That's what made them successful. Then that person will become the new emperor and their family will become the new dynasty. So that's the basic way how the mandate of heaven works in that system. We now need to talk a little bit about Confucius and the exam system. That's also central to how China worked. So if you're the emperor, here's the thing. You want to stay emperor. You don't want to be overthrown. Right? Makes sense. So, but here's the other problem you have. You need loyal officials to help you rule because China is a really big place. China is huge. The emperor cannot be everywhere at once. They don't have cell phones or email or any kind of instant communication. There's parts of the country that the emperor is never going to be able to visit in person. So the emperor needs loyal officials to help him rule. But here's the problem. Being an official is the best job there is in traditional China. That's the best job you can have, is to be a government official. Unfortunately, one reason for that is because it gives you an opportunity for corruption. If you're an official, right, the emperor can't be everywhere. When the peasants pay their taxes, you could keep some of those taxes for yourself. Or you could add additional taxes. Or you could promote your incompetent family members and give them positions in the government. And then they could be corrupt and take people's money. And the problem with that is, the more corrupt your government is, the more inefficient it is, and the less it's able to do things like make sure that the people have enough food to eat, clothes to wear, and places to live. And of course, when people lack those things, they're likely to rebel and try and overthrow the dynasty. So if you're an emperor, you want loyal officials who will help you rule competently. They'll do a good job. They'll make sure that people are well fed, that they have clothes to wear, they have a place to live, and you want people who aren't too corrupt. And that's a problem because everyone wants to be a government official, in part because there's the opportunity for corruption. So how do you deal with this problem? And the way that the Chinese emperors dealt with this system was they developed exams. They had exams. So if you want to become a government official, you had to pass some exams. Usually there were 3 exams that you had to pass. Now, one thing I want to point out, the exam system is very complex. It changed over time. I'm just giving you a very rough outline. But you use an exam system to choose who would be the officials. Usually you had to pass 3. However, you got benefits even if you only passed 1. So if you passed that first exam, you would, for example, there were certain taxes you didn't have to pay. You couldn't, if you were arrested, they couldn't torture you. Torture was acceptable. In this time period, it was actually considered necessary. But if you had passed exams, you couldn't be tortured. And you also got to wear special clothing. You got to wear like a scholar's robe that told everyone, hey, I'm awesome, I passed the exam. Now, one thing I want to point out, imagine if there was an exam that you could take and you would never have to pay sales tax. You would totally study for that exam, right? You want to pass that exam. Not having to pay sales tax would be awesome. So I want to emphasize, lots of people studied this exam. Because first of all, being a government official is the best thing. But also, even if you could only pass 1, you got some real good concrete benefits. Now, you may logically say to me, well, how does this solve the problem? How does having people pass an exam help you find officials that aren't corrupt? I mean, bad people could get a good grade in math. So why couldn't you get a good grade in this exam and still be a bad person? And the answer has to do with the contents. The contents were the teachings of Confucius. Right? The contents were the teachings of Confucius. I talk a lot about him in History 121. I don't want to talk a whole lot about him here, but the key thing about Confucius was he focused on morality. He focused on being loyal to the emperor and being good to the common people. So in a sense, by studying for the exams, you were being morally indoctrinated. You were being taught that your highest virtues are to do what the emperor wants you to do, and be good to the people who you're ruling over. Now, do people miss those things? Yeah, of course. Sometimes, you can teach people stuff, they won't listen, it doesn't change their character. But the key thing was this helped create a ruling ideology that emphasized that the purpose of government officials was to be loyal to the emperor, to be good to the people. While you could have some exceptions to that, for the most part, what the exams did was they made sure that the people who did pass understood what correct morality was, and they had been indoctrinated with this idea that you're supposed to be loyal to the emperor, benevolent to the people, make sure that the people have enough food to eat, clothes to wear, places to live. And if they can say yes to all those things, the dynasty is not going to be overthrown. And to a large degree, this did work, right? It's hard to overemphasize the importance of this. This did create a group of officials who were smart because it was not easy to pass these exams, and who understood morality and had a basic desire to fulfill that morality because it really did impact their worldview. And I want to stress, this system worked really well, worked for about 2,000 years. That's a pretty good system. Now, there's a problem though. Remember, we're trying to understand this basic question, why don't they emphasize development? Well, in China, the focus was on morality, not technical knowledge. When you took these exams, they weren't asking you questions like, what's the best way to collect taxes? How do you make sure people follow the law? They were asking questions about morality. So in China, if you were really smart and a very creative person, you didn't go into science. That's technical knowledge. That's not really important. What's really important is learning to be moral and understanding the Confucian classics. That's what you should focus on. So if you have a society based around if you're a smart person and you want to rise in society, you focus on Confucianism and morality. You don't focus on science. You're not rewarded for doing that. There's a good reason why they focus on morality. That's what keeps their civilization together. That's what allows China to be gigantic. That's what allows for the government to see to the needs of the common people. So Confucianism works. In a sense, it works too well. So well that the Chinese will focus so much on morality, not so much on technical knowledge. And that will help prevent them from developing in the same way that Westerners will. They're not going to have a scientific revolution in the same way Western civilizations will. And it helps to limit their development.